Hello, I'm David Elwood, Dean of the Kennedy School, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Forum, John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. We are here tonight for a very grand event indeed. We're here to honor someone who I suspect in this audience really needs no introduction, but a very, very great man. Great in all kinds of different respects. I will start simply by stating that I took a lot of courses in my life. There is no question that my best course was taught by Tom Schelling. There is no question I remember my first paper. I remember he said this thing was good and this thing was bad. I remember more from that course and more anecdotes from that course than I do from what I did earlier today. And it's a tribute to the man that part of what Tom is so good at is taking very simple ideas or concepts or simple stories and converts them into very, very big and powerful ideas. Now, my role here this evening is mostly to gush over Tom very briefly, which I'm just about done with, but I'm also want to tell you how we're going to organize the events here tonight. What we start with is actually a video clip, and I'll introduce that in just a moment. It relates actually very much to the class I took years ago. Next, we are going to have Eva Stokes come up, and she will then introduce our panel members. Our panel members will speak for a while. Tom will speak. Then there'll be a discussion. Then there'll be another video clip, and then we'll come to an end. Now, if you add up all the numbers, you may think, I see, about 10 p.m. we'll get finished, and that may be true, but it'll be worth every minute. But we are not going to have a chance to do Q&A this evening, and for that I apologize. Nonetheless, Tom will be back sometime in the next, hopefully this spring and no later than next fall, as the Godkin lecturer. And you can pepper him with every single question, every hard idea that you can possibly imagine. But tonight, we're here to celebrate this remarkable man. So let me say a word or two about our clip, and then I will turn it over. Now, one of the things that happens, at least happened when I took Tom's class, and my guess is most of you who know Tom or have experienced him or even read his books and so forth, know that there's often one of the things, again, starting with this notion of a very simple anecdote with a very big idea, is he'll say the following: suppose you were in a strange place and had to get together. Worse yet, suppose you had to meet someone somewhere in America on some unexpected day, on some unexpected time, in order to make a lot of money or something of that sort. He then goes on to talk about how you might handle that impossible problem. Well, just to prove that even American TV can catch up with big ideas, let me introduce this video clip right now, which appeared on Primetime Live. It was a show on nothing less than game theory. You can run the clip.
New York City, a colossal urban beehive, and the perfect setting for an astonishing game about human behavior.
Here we go. Dun, 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 dun.
Finding a needle in a haystack would be child's play compared to the contest you're about to see. A handful of players
Off we go.
You want to take a taxi cab?
are coming by land, by sea, even by air, to take a stab at Primetime's Mission Impossible. Good morning. I'm Jay Shadler, and these are your instructions. There's another pair of people who are looking for you today over here in Manhattan.
Really?
They are strangers to you as you are to them. Your job is to find them.
The ending remains a surprise, except to anyone that's taken the course. We'll come to that at the end. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator. Another great hero of mine, and one who taught me as much as there is to teach about teaching economics, about thinking about a variety of ideas, but also about how to be a terrifically supportive and impressive human being. She was a founding member of the school and a lecturer in public policy emeritus. She served for many years as secretary of the school and associate academic dean. She is also the co-author with Richard Zeckhauser, another one of our panelists, of a primer on policy analysis. But like all good books, it's known simply as Stokey and Zeckhauser. The book is still used today in our MPP Corps, and her impact on students continues. What we have here is one of the founders of the school introducing one of the founders of the school. And in that, let me now turn it over to Eva Stokes.
Thank you, David. Usually when we gather here in the forum, we're coming to listen to an array of experts who debate the issues of the day. Some of us come looking for fireworks. We hope maybe we'll see a scorched ego or two. But tonight all is different. Tonight we're celebrating. There will be no hot debate. So let me start us off by introducing our first two speakers very briefly. We'll hear first from Glenn Lowry. Glenn is the Merton Stoltz Professor in the Social Sciences in Brown University's Economics Department. He's with us for this celebration because from 1982 to 91, he was a member of this faculty. In fact, his office was right next door to Tom's. His scholarly work has been in welfare economics, game theory, industrial organization, national resource economics, and the economics of income distribution. Richard Zeckhauser is our second panelist. He is the Kennedy School's Frank Plumpton Ramsey Professor of Political Economy. A microeconomist, his current research addresses how well institutions perform when they're confronted with one or another of several familiar problems. Problems such as the necessity to make decisions on the basis of inconsistent or insufficient information. Problems such as the inability to command and to commit sufficient resources, or having to cope with the difficulties created by human beings who behave too opportunistically or too irrationally. Much of Richard's work runs along lines parallel to Tom's. Glenn, you're on first.
Okay. Let me start by saying what a great honor it is to be asked to participate in this event, honoring my old friend, my mentor, my former colleague, and Nobel Laureate in economics, Tom Schelling. It can't be that anyone associated with the Kennedy School who learned about Tom's receiving the Nobel Prize wouldn't be just ecstatic, and of course I was. I was elated, both for Tom personally and for an acknowledgement of the intellectual path that he has blazed and the way to use social science to think about complicated problems in contemporary society that his work exemplifies. So I want to just say here a little bit in reflecting on this great man and his legacy, his accomplishments, how it has impacted me. I came here to the Kennedy School as a young scholar in my early 30s, very interested in race and in doing rigorous work on the problems of racial inequality and conflict in our society and around the world. But I was also very much a headstrong, young, mathematically adept economic theorist who was concerned about rigor, about getting it right, about the dotting of I's and the crossing of T's, about solving hard problems, about writing papers that most people couldn't read. And I was in despair when I got here in those years in the early 1980s about whether or not those two different aspects of my own personal intellectual makeup could be made compatible with one another. And the great debt that I owe to Tom is that he showed me that indeed they could be made compatible with one another, that one could be hard-nosed and hard-headed, one could be as rigorous as the next fellow, but one could also attend to problems that really mattered, and one could attend to them with depth, with breadth and subtlety, not to reduce them to mathematical exercises. One could read history, one could be knowledgeable about philosophy, one could take culture into account, one could treat politics like the serious business that it is, and one could still, as an economist, address oneself to these to these issues. Tom showed me by his own example in his work, and by the work that we did collaboratively, not writing books and papers, we didn't collaborate on any research output, but in our teaching and in our conversations, I had the good fortune of my office being located right next to his. Tom took it upon himself when I arrived here in the early 1980s to organize a seminar of distinguished faculty around the university, from the anthropology department and the law school and the economics department and sociology, to talk about the problem of race and social division in global context. He did that because that was something I was interested in doing, that he was also interested in, and it opened up an entirely new world for me. And then we mounted this course together, which we taught for several years through the mid and late 1980s, Public Policy in Divided Societies. It was classical Tom Schelling, his models of segregation and the dynamics of groups interacting with each other, his information and signaling and all the rest, his clever application of strategic insights to practical day-to-day problems. But now it was how the Sinhalese and the Tamil were going to deal with each other in Sri Lanka. Now it was how the Lebanese government was going to structure its constitution to account for the essential conflicts between the various ethnic groups in that country. It was all of these kinds of problems, but Tom's insights. Tom was also, and I will close because time is limited, a dear, dear friend during these years. Some of these years were difficult years for me personally. Tom was always there. He was not only a mentor, not only a colleague, he was and he is a very dear friend. So again, I'm just grateful to have an opportunity to participate in this event tonight. And here's to Tom.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. Richard?
Can I have the PowerPoint, please? I hope that you can see this. But first I want to reiterate everything that Glenn said. Tom was my undergraduate advisor, my graduate advisor. He was the guy who got me into the Kennedy School. He was the person who got me interested in almost every problem that I've been interested in across my career. What I try to stress for my students is what Tom's career represents, which is Thomas Schelling learning from the real world and vice versa. Namely, the world has learned from Tom Schelling. One of the most interesting things about Tom is that it's very hard to know whether he was interested in the conceptual problem first or the real world problem first, but my impression is they always wove together. So many years ago, starting in the 1950s, he was concerned with the most important problem of the time, which was avoiding nuclear war. And a book that was cited strongly in the Nobel Prize, The Strategy of Conflict, grew out of that interest. Glenn mentioned his work on racial segregation. That led to a book that's read by at least all of my students, Micromotives and Macro Behavior, which basically explains that what individuals desire collectively isn't achieved if they follow their own personal concerns at various times. Then he led a smoking project here for most of a decade. Tom has few failings. One of them was many, many years ago, he was a smoker. Okay, he stopped smoking. He led a smoking project. He knew everything there was to know about the world. And he wrote a book, Choice and Consequence, which basically the most famous metaphor to emerge from that was that of the divided self. The person who goes into the midnight kitchen and eats a snack and in the morning says, I will never do that again. You won't believe it if Edith happens to tell you how old Tom is, but I'm just going to tell you that he owes us at least 2 more conceptual books. One's coming with the Godkin Lecture, and David will have that other distinguished lecture series a few years later. But in recent years, he's been interested in global warming. For the last few years, he's come to my class each year, and he's talked about global warming. He just comes because he's around Cambridge. I say, Tom, these students love you. He says, okay, I'll come and talk to them. And he's talking, I don't know what he's going to tell us tonight, but he's been talking about nuclear taboos. The best thing that happened over the last 50 years was that there was no nuclear war. The worst thing that's happened in the last 20 years is lots of new nations have developed the potential to have nuclear weapons. And Tom is concerned about how we maintain a taboo against that over many years. The tacit communication problem has already been mentioned. I just want to say that just as there's an objective for you and somebody else to meet in New York City, there's the question of that I think fascinated him initially, which is tacit communication between the Soviet Union and the United States. Two sworn enemies, but two countries that had more of a common interest than any two nations had ever had before in history, because they could destroy each other. Let me just say a few words about Tom in the Kennedy School. He was a founder of the school and a primary player. He was the intellectual lodestone for many years. But I wanted to say something for Dean Elwood, who has charged us with developing some signature courses for the Kennedy School. And the one that my area is supposed to come up with is how to think like an economist. And of course, all you have to do to come up with that course is go back and capture what Tom Schelling was talking about 35 years ago, because his course was how to think like an economist. So we'll bottle him tonight, and we'll present him, next year. This is a variant on something that it's not called the Schelling diagram, except for those of us who know and love him. But this is, Tom might speak today on what the Nobel Prize will accomplish. Now, he has this diagram which basically gives the payoffs to two classes of people. One is the group of people that select the curve on the top, and the other is the people who select the curve on the bottom. Now, frequently in these diagrams, the two curves cross, and that's some sort of equilibrium, or maybe there's an equilibrium at either end. But when I was thinking about knowing about Tom Schelling, I realized that there were many people who were on that bottom curve who would be much better off if they were on the top curve, but they didn't know what they don't know. So I think that the world has been sort of residing at A, where only a small percentage of the world, a large percentage of the people in this room, but a small percentage of the world were familiar with what Tom Schelling could teach them. And what the Nobel Prize did was significantly increase the number of people who know what Tom Schelling knows. Now, clearly, that's a move from A to B. That's clearly, I believe, of benefit to the people who are learning, that they're moving to a higher curve and they're moving along the curve. I think it's even a benefit for most of us who know what he knows if other people know that. So we will be able to tacitly communicate with them better. We will not get messed up by issuing idle threats that have to be carried out, or making promises that they don't believe will keep so that they don't in fact keep. I'm not sure how the lower curve goes. I'm not sure, as someone who doesn't know what Tom Schelling has to teach us, whether we want more people to know what he knows or whether we don't know. And I think it really depends on which particular of the 50,000 items that you can learn from Tom Schelling is involved. But anyhow, for you, everybody in this audience, you've leapt to the top curve so that we're better off. I just want to say a word here. This is Tom's work that he did many years ago about the divided self, which has now become a central subject within economics. You see the same gentleman there. He's my midnight kitchen man. The big man who's weighing down the scales is the fellow who's smoking. And the littler version of the same man with the no smoking sign with a halo around his head is the person who says, I won't smoke. And the trouble is, the immediacy of the moment tends to let the smoker outweigh the fellow who would rather have the prohibition. This has come to be known in economics as hyperbolic discounting, a very practical piece of advice that you can get from Tom Schelling if you're a smoker or if you're an overeater or whatever else it is to avoid being in the situations where the big bad guy outweighs the little guy. So for me, that means at night, don't go down into the kitchen where there's all this food around screaming, eat me, eat me. Instead, stay upstairs, and it really does work. Avoid the queue. Queue theory is a big subject now in economics. Okay, a former dean of the Kennedy School is famous for having written the book, Bowling Alone. I want to tell you what the Nobel Prize does for us. The Nobel Prize, it's not bowling alone, it's rejoicing together. So this gives us an opportunity. There are too few wonderful events, and this has certainly been a wonderful event. Even if Tom hadn't won the Nobel Prize, it would have been a wonderful event for all of his friends to get together and say why the people in Scandinavia didn't know what they were doing. I want to talk a little bit about Tom's greatest accomplishment. They give us a version of this screen, but I can't read it from here, so you won't mind if I do this. This is from an introduction that I wrote to a new biography that's out, or will be out in a few weeks, on Tom Schelling. But the United States and the Soviet Union, supposedly sworn enemies, had the greatest interest in cooperation of any two nations in history. Cooperation, primarily to avoid nuclear war, was harder to achieve, but still possible given our ostensible enemy status. Thomas Schelling worked tirelessly as scholar, major government advisor, and frequent international participant from the 1950s through today to make nuclear war less possible. And this is, you can maybe read faster than I can talk, and I'm only going to say a few words. But when the history of the world from 1950 through 1990 is written, it will be recognized that the great historical event of that era was something that did not happen. Despite grave dangers, no nuclear weapon was launched against an enemy. The intellectual models of conflict and cooperation provided by Thomas Schelling and his willingness to work tirelessly to get policymakers from all corners of the world to understand their implications deserve considerable credit for ensuring this non-event. Thomas Schelling, I've skipped here, has made remarkable contributions to scholarship in telling us how the world works, deep insights into addiction, bargaining processes, and racial segregation. His greatest contribution to the world, however, is the work that he did over many years and that continues. He helped to make the world a safer place to live. For that, the world is grateful. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Turn that off.
Yeah. I'm scheduled to talk a little bit about Tom Schelling's role in this school as we saw him in the Kennedy School, and then introduce him. But as a matter of fact, what you've been hearing already from Glenn and Richard is an introduction of a sort. So I'm going to continue with that model. What I am about to tell you about what he did in the school is part of the introduction of telling you what Tom has done. Incidentally, Richard mentioned this foreword that he has written. There will be copies available here at the podium at the end of the program, and you're welcome to pick them up if you'd like. And I agree with Zach. I don't always agree with him. But I have no doubt that most of the Kennedy School people who are here tonight would be here, and a host of others too, would be here for any celebration honoring Tom Schelling, Nobel or no Nobel. For us, the Nobel is just the frosting on the cake. Why so? Though it's Tom's research that has made him world famous, there's a lot more to the story. For Tom's contribution to this school are truly beyond measure. As Richard noted, Tom was one of the founding fathers of the Kennedy School. He served for 20 years as the Lucius Littauer Professor of Political Economy. And those were years that were critical for this, that was a new school in what was really a new industry. Tom not only carried out his research, he taught over 1,000 students during his years here, and he was a key figure in the critical decisions early in the days of the school, in defining the mission of the school and designing the organizational structure to carry out that mission. That sounds like a lot of words, designing the organizational structure. Figuring out how to deliver the goods on that mission was a very difficult task. And we're still at it, needless to say. Along the way, he chaired the public policy program in its early days. Later, he took on the mid-career program and rebuilt that. It now enrolls over 200 students a year. Less visibly, he worked constantly behind the scene to build consensus and ward off potential disasters. Best of all was the way he stimulated us, as he enlivened seminars as he taught, and the way he delivered his penetrating insights. You know, occasionally new faculty will ask me what it was like having Tom Schelling here. I want to answer. I'd love to tell you, do you have all day? But don't worry, I'm not going to take that track. But I do want to give you a small glimpse of Schelling in action. 30 or 40 years ago, Tom will correct me, I'll hash this up because I don't remember 30 or 40 years ago any better than I remember yesterday. But anyway, it doesn't matter. 30 or 40 years ago, a 3-year-old girl fell down a well in Oklahoma. Over the next week, the struggle to rescue her was truly desperate. It had 24/7 media coverage nationwide. The cost ran to something like $2 to $3 million. Actually, I think I recall that what they had to do was dig a second well right next to the first one because that was the only way they could reach her without injuring her further. Anyway, happily, she was rescued in good shape. At about the same time, Congress was dragging its heels on a bill to appropriate funds to inoculate the babies in poor families against several of the more dangerous childhood diseases. The sum involved was in the same ballpark, about $2 to $3 million a year. The Center for Disease Control estimated that these inoculations would save a dozen babies a year on average. But there was little public pressure to get Congress to act. Tom, in typical Schelling fashion, saw a connection between these two situations. He posed the question, why do we find such differences in attitudes with support for spending whatever was needed in one case and disinterest, even reluctance, in the other? Tom's research style on this question was also typical of him. He didn't dig out the data and analyze it. He didn't construct a model. He just closed his door, sat back in his chair, and thought. A new way to do things. His conclusion was a compelling insight. The little girl was an identified life. People knew whose life would be saved. With the inoculation program, no one could know which babies' lives would be saved. They were statistical lives. Once we see that distinction, we see it everywhere. That, too, is typical. Schelling epiphanies usually turn out to be widely applicable. Policy decisions about measures to reduce the risk of death are essentially decisions about the saving of statistical lives. Whether we're requiring that we wear seat belts, or we're forbidding fireworks, or trying to protect our population against suicide bombers. Interestingly, the story has a further and altogether different dimension. If next week you remember anything at all about statistical versus identified lives, I bet it will be at least in part because of that little girl in Oklahoma. That, too, is part of Tom's genius. He embeds his insight in a familiar context: hockey helmets, thermostats, crowded highways, using the familiar to attract our interest and strengthen our understanding. It's a wonderfully effective teaching model. Tom, I wish you could have been here last October 11th to see at first hand the elation that swept through this school when your award was announced. It was far more than just excitement over the award. It was a universal recognition of what you have contributed to this school and a heartfelt demonstration of our deep affection for you personally. Welcome back. Over to you.
Thank you, Eva.
You can go to the podium.
I was instructed to stand up at the podium, but somebody moved the podium back, so I'm going to sit here comfortably
Oh, we can put it forward.
and talk to you. It's a joy, of course, to be here. It's hard to think of anybody I love more than Dick, Glenn, or Edith. Edith referred to me as one of the founding... Who? Edith referred to me as one of the founding fathers. She should have said, I'm one of the founding parents. She's one of the founding parents. And it's important that we not call all of us fathers who, some of us are more feminine than that. I could give you a lecture. I have a lecture that lasts exactly 42 minutes, but it's available on the web. It's what I said in Stockholm as a condition for receiving the Nobel Prize. And it's a good lecture. And I don't think we have quite the 42 minutes it would take, so I won't even bother to summarize it. I would like to talk about two things. One is what it's like to be awarded a Nobel Prize. I had no way of knowing what it would be like. The second thing I want to talk briefly about, the Nobel Selection Committee said that I had advanced our understanding of conflict and cooperation with the help of game theory analysis. And that led to the question, am I or have I ever been a game theorist? And I will talk about that in a few minutes. First, what's it like to win a Nobel Prize? Well, one thing has already been mentioned, especially by Edith. It made so many of my friends so extraordinarily happy. Not to mention children and grandchildren and sisters. But that really, I think, turned out to be the most exhilarating part of it all. Just how many people, obviously, were made so happy because of some recognition that came to me. The second thing is, and this is important, I became a matter of publicity. Within 24 hours after the announcement of my prize, the op-ed editor of the Wall Street Journal emailed me and said, Professor Schelling, anything you'd like to send us, we will publish. He probably knew that the editorial page, the op-ed page, was probably opposed to almost anything I was likely to submit. But I submitted and he published it. I figured, this is bound to be read by Donald Rumsfeld. Somebody will ask him if he's seen it. What happened that Donald Rumsfeld, some months before, maybe a whole year before, had referred to me on the same op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal as that distinguished historian, Thomas Schelling. My conjecture is he was thinking of a foreword I wrote to a wonderful book that was published back in 1962, a book about the attack on Pearl Harbor. And a lot of people discovered that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a good thing to look at in thinking about the attack on the Twin Trade Towers and the Pentagon in 2001. And I was asked all over the place for copies of my 2.5-page foreword to that book. I think what happened was that Secretary Rumsfeld thought I had read the book, and I'd written the book, and not just the 2.5 pages forward, and that's why I was the distinguished historian. I take this as an opportunity. I have a particularly strong set of opinions about what the nuclear weapons policy of the U.S. government should be, especially what the attitude of the U.S. government should be toward the possibility of an Iranian nuclear weapon and the possibility of North Korean nuclear weapons. And I think the policies of the U.S. government in those directions, the policies are, if not disastrous, very bad. So I like to think that I have an opportunity to be heard. I've been out giving a variety of lectures, and I find when I get an invitation from an audience that I think could conceivably have any interest, I use my Nobel Prize to attract invitations of that kind so that I can speak where I may have to be listened to. And that's, I think, probably the most important thing that I acquired with this prize. The first question I was asked, the morning of the announcement, I went out to the University of Maryland to a press conference, and the first question I got was, what am I going to do with all the money? Well, there's a very simple answer to that. Most of it goes to the federal, state, and county income taxes. A lot of the rest went to financing my whole family's trip to Stockholm. And then Alice could tell you that quite a bit more went to outfitting her for the ceremonial occasions we were going to confront once we got to Stockholm. And so it makes a lot of difference to win this prize. But now let me go to the more serious question. Am I a game theorist? It will interest you to know that I first learned game theory when I read a book published in 1957 by Howard Rafa, who's sitting here, and Duncan Luce. Games and Decisions, it was called. I spent more hours reading and studying that book than any other book, including the Holy Bible, that I have ever read. And the interesting thing is that the two things for which the Nobel Selection Committee stated that for which I had won this prize, both were things I published before the book by Howard and Duncan came out. In other words, I didn't know any game theory when I wrote the two most important things for which I am called a game theorist. Now that raises the question, could I have been a game theorist without knowing it? I like to think that the answer is I was a game theorist before I knew any game theory. And I thought I was, because I thought I was doing what game theory should be about. Game theory is usually defined, I think a little narrowly, as the study of rational decision when the best decision for any individual depends on the decisions that another or several others may also make, where the other or several others' own decision depends on what decisions they anticipate that I will make or am already making. There's a narrow definition, which is it's the mathematical analysis of those situations, but I think we can skip that. I think if I brought anything to the study of game theory that was novel, it was that I was interested not so much just in the question of how rational people can anticipate each other's choices, but how rational people can influence each other's choices. So I got interested, partly because I spent 5 years in the government dealing with foreign aid negotiations. I got interested in how one can make a threat or a promise or a commitment that is believable. How do you threaten, whether it's nuclear weapons or divorce or a strike or to break off communication, especially when it is known that you would prefer not to do what you're threatening to do? How can you make a promise that is believable when it would call for something that, left to your own devices, you'd rather not have to do it? How in the middle of a negotiation can you state a position from which you will not withdraw and make it clear that you cannot withdraw? And that's the thing I wrote about that I published before Howard's book came out. And I used very simple examples from modern things like the answer that Dean Acheson gave to the Senate when President Truman said he wanted to station 7 divisions of U.S. Army troops in Europe once the NATO treaty was ratified, and was asked by the Senate, you want authority to station close to 300,000 American troops in Europe. Can they halt a Soviet attack? And Dean Acheson said no. There's not enough to halt an Eastern attack, an attack by the Soviet Union and the other Eastern Bloc countries. And they said, well, then what are the troops there for? And Dean Acheson said, to threaten to die. And the Soviets will know that they can't kill or take captive 300,000 American troops and maybe their families and hope that the war will stop there. This is to commit the United States to an involvement from which it can't escape even if it wishes to. And then I found, going back 2,500 years, when Xenophon and 10,000 Greeks were retreating from the Persian campaign, they were surrounded by 40,000 Persians, and there was a ravine at their backs. And one of his generals said, don't you think this is a precarious position to be in? We have no escape. And Xenophon said, no, that's exactly what we want. We want them to know that they can back off any time they get tired of fighting, but we can't do anything but fight to the last man. We want them to know that. And it's the ravine at our backs that makes it clear. That was like the idea in World War I that machine gunners in the German army were locked and chained to their machine guns. And it was argued, this is in the interest of the machine gunner, because it means that nobody can rush the machine gunner hoping that he will run away. They know that all he can do to save himself is use his machine gun. And that meant that they might try to bypass him, but at least he would never desert his gun. Well, that was the kind of thing that I wrote about, and I think that should be part of what game theory is concerned with. We can ask Howard afterwards, but I think Howard agrees with me. And so that I would say that I did what I think game theory should be. I even wrote something. In 1958, I published something called Toward a Prospectus for the Reorientation of Game Theory. And I sort of argued that this is what I thought game theory should be about, which would make it, among other things, a historical empirical study as well as a purely logical study. And I thought I might influence somebody, but I didn't really influence anybody but about half a dozen people, including Howard Rafa, so that I felt that I hadn't got anywhere by suggesting what I thought game theory might usefully be about. But so I finally decided, when the Nobel Selection Committee referred to me, not as a game theorist, but as somebody who used game theory, that at first my thought was, damn it, I don't want to be identified as a game theorist. That's not what I think I am. I'm a social scientist. But then I decided, if they can have any influence to help people realize that game theory should include the kind of thing I did, and people don't have to apologize for doing that kind of thing, I decided I would welcome their characterization. So there I am, out of the closet as a game theorist. And it's an enormous pleasure to be here and see so many people that I love and worked with. Harvard is a great place. The Kennedy School is a great place. As full of wonderful people. And I'm so happy to be here, looking at you and talking to you. Thank you very much.
Enough clapping.
Thank you, Tom. As always, it's been a joy to listen to you. And as always, you've given us a lot to think about. Now we have time for a few minutes of discussion with the panel before we get back to the video. Richard?
As I was listening to you, Tom, I realized that Donald Rumsfeld was not your student. He was sort of going along on that lower curve. He didn't know what he didn't know. And the world would have been a better place if he had been your student. So I want you to comment with the wisdom of hindsight. If you had an hour to talk to Donald Rumsfeld and knew that he would really be a good student and would have learned, not about what he should do specifically with Iran or North Korea, which may not have been such pressing issues at that time, or you can't deal with a specific topic, but teach him some of the principles that emerge in your work when he was first appointed as Secretary of Defense. Can you think what you'd have liked to have taught him, and can you speculate on how it would have made a difference? Assuming he would have learned.
If this were the beginning of his
Right.
stint as Secretary of Defense, I don't know what I would have told him. I know what I would like to tell him now.
We'll take that.
I don't think he would let me in, but no, I would tell him two things. I'd say first, the taboo on the use of nuclear weapons, taboo being the word that John Foster Dulles used in the Eisenhower cabinet. Dulles didn't like the taboo. He said we must find a way to get rid of the moral objections to the use of nuclear weapons. This taboo is based on a false distinction. We must get rid of it. I would try to tell Rumsfeld that the taboo against the use of nuclear weapons, which has been very powerful. We didn't use nuclear weapons. Margaret Thatcher didn't use nuclear weapons in the Falkland. Golda Meir didn't use nuclear weapons in 1973 when the Egyptians had two complete armies on her side of the Suez Canal with no civilians anywhere near. She didn't use nuclear weapons. And the Soviets went through that ugly, demoralizing war in Afghanistan without using nuclear weapons. I would say this taboo, and I would not have thought that the Soviets would have appreciated it, but they obviously did. This taboo is one of the greatest assets we have, and we should do everything we can in our government policy to strengthen it and do nothing that may undermine it. I perceive that everything the U.S. government is doing now is more in the direction of undermining it than strengthening it. And I would try to persuade him that you may think this country is rich in nuclear weapons, and it would be a shame not to be able to use them whenever it's convenient, but this country is rich in people, structures, and culture, and it would be a shame to see the nuclear taboo disappear when we and a lot of others may need it. I think Golda Meir understood 30 years ago that someday her neighbors would have nuclear weapons, and anything she could do to establish and strengthen the taboo by not using them when the temptation was so powerful, she must have foreseen that eventually, 30 years later, the taboo would be in her national interest. And the second thing I would try to persuade Donald Rumsfeld of would be, and I can't go into this, I did talk about it at lunch today upstairs, I think we want the Iranians and the North Koreans, in the event they get nuclear bombs, to become as sophisticated as possible about what nuclear weapons are good for and what they're not good for, how they should be used and how they should not be used, what some of the responsibilities are when you get them, what kind of secure custody you may need, how to decide whom to entrust them to, whether the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the vaults of the central bank, a palace guard. Whom can you trust with nuclear weapons? Recognizing that so many countries undergo some kind of upheaval or civil war, and it matters a lot who can get his hands on the nuclear weapons, if there are nuclear weapons. And I would like the Iranians, if they get the bomb, and the North Koreans, if they get or already have the bomb, not to be as unthinking as the US government was for the first 15 years of the nuclear era. It wasn't until the middle 1960s that we had anything like combination locks on our nuclear weapons. And it wasn't until the late 1950s that it became apparent to the US government that a strategic striking force that was itself vulnerable to attack might not deter the attack that could destroy it. I don't think we want the Iranians and North Koreans to spend 15 years as stupid as the smartest people in the world, namely the Americans, were, about the need for secure custody of nuclear weapons and the need to make sure that you don't make your retaliatory force so vulnerable that it may invite the enemy to initiate nuclear war. I even think we want any terrorists who may possibly acquire nuclear weapons to think deeply and be sophisticated, rather than think that the best use you can make of these things is to go and blow up Boston. I want them to recognize that nuclear weapons, indeed, have been very useful for 60 years to acquire influence, what we used to call deterrence. I think in the future we're going to learn a lot about what it's like to be deterred. We were deterred in 1956 against entering Hungary. We were deterred in 1968 against entering Czechoslovakia. I think if the Iranians ever get nuclear weapons, I would like them to think that the best use they could make of nuclear weapons is to deter the United States or Russia or Israel or any other nation from attacking or trying to invade Iran. I think if we can persuade them that that makes more sense than blowing up Tel Aviv or Los Angeles or Hamburg, that we're better off the smarter they are. And I would like to find ways to make sure that the next possessors of nuclear weapons don't take as long as the US did to think its way into a fairly rational policy of how to use and how not to use nuclear weapons.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question on the same topic, Tom, at least related. And in the New York Times, maybe 10 days, 2 weeks ago, the columnist David Brooks had a piece saying, we have to take into account that the people in Tehran who might have a nuclear weapon soon don't think the same way that the people in Washington and Moscow thought, that they are under the sway of Islamic radicalism, that they can't be counted on to be deterred by the kind of rational calculation that sustained the peace during the Cold War. Whether he's right or wrong about that, I'm interested in your views about whether you think the same structure of incentives and interests that made the US and the Soviet Union have more in common than any two nations in the world would apply in a context of a nuclear-armed Islamic radical state. And if not, what would you see as the constraining forces that could keep the peace under those circumstances?
I don't know. I do know this. Over the last 30 or 40 years, people like Al Carnasale and I have been going to conferences all around the world on nuclear weapons policy. And for 30 or 40 years, we've always had Indian and Pakistani defense intellectuals participating. The Indians and the Pakistanis have had decades to think about what nuclear weapons may be good for and what they're not good for, and how secure they need to be, and what custodial arrangements may work. And I've never seen an Iranian or a North Korean at any such discussion. Therefore, I don't know whether anybody in Iran has learned to think carefully about what nuclear weapons are good for and what they're not good for. And I badly want to entice whoever in Iran is in a position of influence to think very carefully about this and learn about it. And I don't know how they learn, especially if they're not allowed to talk to Americans or Japanese or Germans or English about nuclear weapons policy. I'm very much interested in how we can insert into their thinking something that will keep them from going, as we did, 15 years without thinking about locks on nuclear weapons, 15 years without thinking about the need to have your striking force not in a form that invites preemptive attack. And I don't think we can do it from the American side. I don't know how many of you remember, but about 20 years ago, the Middle East Research Center at Harvard was planning to have a conference on Islamic fundamentalism, and people were invited from as far away as Indonesia, people from Pakistan, people from Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. And 48 hours before the conference was to begin, it was authoritatively leaked that the travel expenses of all of these people to come to an Islamic fundamental conference, the travel expenses were being paid by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. Some of you are too young to remember, but I vividly remember that. You know what happened? There were no direct flights from most of those places. Everybody had to change planes in London, Hamburg, Milan, Rome, or somewhere. They all got off their airplanes and turned around and went home. Some said it would be worth more than my job to continue on to Cambridge. Some said it would be worth more than my life to go to a conference financed by the CIA. I think this means that the United States is not in a very good position to invite Iranians and North Koreans to a seminar in which they will listen to people like me talk to them about nuclear weapons. I think we have to find some way to encourage their participation in some kind of educational thinking about what the responsibilities are when you get nuclear weapons. I proposed, slightly facetiously, but not altogether so, at noon today at a talk I gave, that maybe we could get the Chinese to invite Iranians, North Koreans, Indians, Pakistanis, maybe Israelis, to a series of conferences to talk about what happens if you become a newly nuclear-armed nation. Somebody told me that's probably a bad idea, that the Chinese wouldn't do it. But I'm trying to think, who might somehow find a way to begin some articulate conversation among these people who have responsibility they may never have thought about before. So my hope is that they would eventually be smart enough to begin to think their way through it. There are a lot of things they should think about. One is, there was at least one country in which a revolt occurred by the army against the established regime when there were nuclear weapons on the territory. That was Greece. An army revolt deposed the royal family and set up a military dictatorship. And there were U.S. nuclear weapons in Greece at the time. That suggests that you can have a military revolt in a country that has nuclear weapons. There was a time when, in Argentina, the Army and the Navy were on opposite sides of a civil war. It would have made a lot of difference if there were Argentine nuclear weapons, whether the Navy had them or the Army had them or they both had them. And I would like Iranians, if they are of any influence, and North Koreans, if they have any influence, to think about some of the historical events that could happen in Iran. Suppose the Shah had had nuclear weapons. The Shah had plans for 18 nuclear power reactors from which they could have extracted plutonium, and they probably had the the chemistry to separate enough plutonium to make nuclear weapons. Well, the Shah got deposed before he could do anything like that, but you know, suppose he'd had a few nuclear weapons. I don't know whether he would have entrusted them to his military services. For all I know, he would have sent them to Israel and said, keep custody for me because I don't trust anybody in my own country. And if I ever get deposed, I think if I had some nuclear weapons, it would make me the equivalent of a nuclear weapons state, even though I have no territory. But I think that there are a lot of these historical events that suggest that it isn't altogether comfortable to be sitting on top of a country that possesses nuclear weapons and you don't know whom you can trust. And I'd like some of these people to reflect on these before they go gleefully forward to get nuclear weapons. But I think, at least I would like them to think that the last thing they want to do is waste nuclear weapons killing people.
Thank you, Tom. I think it's time to wrap up now and to get back to our video. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, in this case the ranch is Manhattan, there are 4 pairs of contestants walking the streets looking for each other. 2 of the pairs have already found each other. They're enjoying the view from the 82nd floor of the Empire State Building. I'm going to refrain from commenting on the gender of the 2 who got in first. But anyway, what's going on with the 4 pairs who are still searching for each other? We're moving forward now to what is roughly 2.5 hours after the start of the contest.
You're not looking for anybody from ABC News by any chance, are you? No.
If this game had a Geiger counter, Chuck and Brad would be deaf from its alarm. On the 86th floor of the Empire State Building, they're so close to the gold. And yet,
would they be outside looking for us on the street?
It's as plausible as anything else.
For more than 5 minutes, they wander through the tourists.
Well, I don't see anybody that looks, but it isn't noon yet.
No, that's true.
And then, just as they are about to pass invisibly by the 4 women,
are you looking for 2 people from ABC News?
Yes.
So are we.
I'm like,
I'm you can see.
Hi. How are you?
Well, fine, thank
Hi,
you.
Brad. I'm
Now we're trying to
Lydia.
figure out what...
incredibly less than 3 hours after they began, 3 pairs of our strangers are all standing in the very same spot. But over in Times Square, the women aren't finding anyone. Meantime,
I got a good feeling, man. I don't know if that means anything, but...
David and Anthony's strategy is to just keep wandering and watching.
Hey.
Suddenly, at one of the busiest crossroads in the world,
Are those some people over there? Is that them?
they stumble upon Sarah and Jessica.
Show us your sign.
Thank you.
Where are you?
Right here.
Hold that sign up.
For a moment, confusion. Then,
Where's the team you're looking for?
Oh.
celebration.
We did it! They said we couldn't do it, and we did it! Partner?
That's them. We got it, man.
Congratulations. We did it! We did it!
All of the excitement attracts a small crowd, which draws our final pair in like a couple of magnets. Remarkably, in the strange magic of this game, in a city of millions, all 6 pairs of our strangers found each other in just a matter of hours.
I didn't think you were going to all find each other. You know, I thought maybe some. But are you at all surprised by the fact that it was unanimous? Everybody found each other.
I think the fact that it was something that started out as the impossible task just ended up so simply.
Tom Schelling has been solving impossible tasks for a generation, and he has many more to go, as you heard tonight. Indeed, one of the greatest challenges we face in this generation is, in fact, the impossible task of nuclear weapons. And I think Tom has laid out as good an idea as I think we're likely to hear in quite a long time. I'll just end with a very quick anecdote. I actually do know what it's like to be a young assistant professor when Tom Schelling is around. And indeed, when I first came, Tom Schelling was the head of the mid-career program. My first class, I was teaching economics to mid-career students. I did okay the first class or two until I had to teach about elasticity. Well, there was blood in the streets. It was clearly just a disaster. The students were upset. I ceased to be able to have normal bodily functions. And a variety of other events were transpiring. I got a call from Tom Schelling. David, love to have lunch. How about tomorrow? And Tom, in his wise and careful way, talked me through what the issues were and offered me a gentle guiding hand and some, again, thoughts about thinking like an economist. So the first thing I would say is if we can imitate that idea of thinking like an economist, that will indeed be one of the great signatures of this school. Now, I would also point out one other thing, which is apropos for this program. He actually also gave me one other really good word of advice. It probably was the best advice he ever gave me. That was, go ask Edith. And on that note, I want to thank the very wise and good people here, but most especially Tom Schelling. I should say this book that is coming out about his biography is worth citing for a couple of other reasons. Not only is the foreword by Richard Zeckhauser, it's written by a KSG alum, Robert Dodge, and its publisher, Fred Lyford, who's here with us this evening, has agreed to donate a portion of the proceeds to our own student internship fund. This is a feel-good opportunity for us all. So with that, let's again close the evening and again thank Tom Schelling for making all this possible and for many future celebrations to come. Thank you all very much.